So I'm glad for the opportunity to be here to share this research. I want to ask you all a question, hypothetically, you don't have to answer it, but imagine for yourselves, we're all so locked in, most of us, to our political positions, beliefs, ideology, partisan affiliation, perhaps, maybe there's some independents in here, but probably not many. What would it take for you right now to overnight convert to the opposite persuasion and belief? What sort of transformational phenomenon would it require for you as an individual to surrender all that you've believed in and fought for and subscribed to, and suddenly join men and women who had been your opponents, ideologically, hopefully just that, and become one of them? Because the Erie Canal, for William Henry Seward, is the story of an incredible reversal that set in motion a pretty spectacular political career. As I'll get into today, William Seward was born into a household in which his father pushed him, and he parroted and adopted pretty conservative Jeffersonian democratic beliefs. And it was, like so many Western and Central New Yorkers being converted in the Second Great Awakening, a revival-like instant turn of faith that would, when he was finished doing his rethinking and reevaluation, lead him to become, in many ways, quite progressive, quite radical. And from his beliefs in the Erie Canal, something he had vilified and demonized, Seward emerges as a leading member of a progressive Whig and Republican Party. And from the beginnings of his conversion, turnaround on canals, he adds on more and more and more positive and prescriptive attributes of what he thinks the role of the government should be in the life of the people. Going from someone who was much more hands-off, limited government, conservative, to someone who no longer feared but indeed welcomed investing the state with vast, concentrated power to do works of public good, to replicate what the Erie Canal was for his father's generation for the next one. What is our next great project? Will it be railroads? Will it be transforming our beliefs in immigration? Will it be ending slavery? Things that were also deemed absurd or follies, the way the Erie Canal was branded, maybe even buying a place like Alaska. So that is how I am going to frame this and get us started today. My title then is From Critic to Convert, William Seward, the Erie Canal, and the Making of a Political Identity. And the story of the Erie Canal, which I'll tell through the lens of Seward, is the story of his conversion into the man we would recognize today as our William Seward, the Seward who came to Auburn and becomes recognizably a key figure in the movements we associate him with today. Anti-slavery, Underground Railroad, Lincoln Secretary of State. Had he stayed home in the East, odds are he would have been like his father, who was a minor Jeffersonian Democrat, a believer in those parties' philosophies and principles, probably an acolyte of Martin Van Buren, as he was starting out to be, and a key figure in New York's conservative Democratic Party. But that is not his story. And I have to tell you, the Erie Canal is a story that I am learning. I will not proclaim vast expertise as a generalist in the canal, but we for sure are going to be talking about DeWitt Clinton today and some Erie Canal history recap through the point of view of William Seward. He was just a boy when debates were reverberating throughout New York State whether a proposed waterway, an artery that would ultimately stretch 363 miles and connect New York Harbor to Lake Erie and Buffalo at Niagara, was feasible, desirable, or an impossible dream, a much derided ditch. He is not a participant in these debates, except insofar as he hears them in his father's parlor and is ordered by his father to believe and adopt the House principles, that the canal is exactly that. It is a boondoggle, an incredible overreach of government. By the time he comes of age himself, the Erie Canal is already in motion. It is reality. It is accepted. So he is not part of an earlier generation's debates about the desirability and feasibility. He comes of age when the Erie Canal is already a foregone conclusion. And so for Seward, the Erie Canal becomes something to debate after the fact. And he will insert himself eventually as a champion for growing and expanding it, protecting it, and eventually, once those fights are done, enshrining it in public memory, How will the Erie Canal be talked about by future generations? Who will tell its story, and how will they frame it? And once we get past the era of William Seward actively involved in canal politics, don't worry, we're not done, because even in the 1840s, 1850s, 1860s, Seward continues to try to craft that narrative and claim his version of why the Erie Canal story was important, why it should be inspirational, aspirational, and he wanted new generations of New Yorkers to subscribe to his understanding of it and dream dreams as outlandish, contested, and hotly debated as DeWitt Clinton's own. If he could do this, what couldn't we do next? Don't let your critics stop you from going after a folly. Oops, I gotta learn how the remote control works. Okay, this is Seward's father, Samuel Swayze Seward. Seward was born on May 16th, 1801, downstate in Orange County, New York, the fourth of 6 children. His father was a true 18th century patriarch. He believed that man alone ruled the household. He would tell his wife what to do, his children what to do. His authority was to be unquestioned. And in pretty much every aspect of Seward's upbringing, that was true. No one questioned William Seward's father. Seward's father was also an enslaver. In 1820s census, the last decade of legal slavery in New York after gradual emancipation laws, there are 8 enslaved people in Seward's father's home. Many visitors to the Seward House are shocked to hear that, because you associate the name Seward with freedom and anti-slavery. Seward would later write in his autobiography, he never once heard his father question the morality of the institution. It was a tradition that he sort of swallowed as just what his father said. A necessary evil, and perhaps he didn't always use the word evil when describing this institution. Seward would say he was taught it would be as morally wrong for an enslaved person to escape as it would be for me to contradict my father publicly. This is what his father told him. His father was also a minor Jeffersonian in the state legislature. Jefferson becomes president 2 months before Seward is born, and these are the politics of his household. I'm going to quote a few times for you. I'm going to try not to read from notes. But when he talked about the inheritance he got from his father, Seward described it like this. My father and his associates, and Samuel Swayze is a very wealthy farmer, he's a lawyer, and he's a statesman. He explained it to me like this. Federalists, the opposition party, the party of Alexander Hamilton, really desired a strong and monarchical government. The Democratic Party of smaller government, the party of Jefferson, was the true party of the Revolution that stood in the way of any future monarchy or tyranny, that feared consolidated power, such as Alexander Hamilton was trying to build in a centralized financial system in New York, or later dreams of a strong government in Washington, D.C. Seward was fortunate in many ways that he was diminutive. He had older brothers, younger brothers, hardy, hale, and more adept at working the father's farmlands than he himself. He was slight, he was frail. As a fully grown man, he'd be about 5'3" to 5'6". And so to make something of the pipsqueak, Samuel Seward affords this son and this son alone college education. We'll have to find another outlet for you. And Seward is quite adept. He's intellectual, he's bright, he's vivacious, he's studious. His father's wealth has afforded him mentors and tutors, dancing masters. And so he's already very well prepared when at just 15 years old, he tests into Union College in Schenectady and leaves his father's household, but he does not leave his father's long reach. He will go to Schenectady, a dyed-in-the-wool by now Madisonian, and he considers it his duty to go there and tote the family line. He will enter Union's campus and find 2 debate clubs, and he has to decide which one he wants to join. There's a progressive one, there's a conservative one. He joins the more conservative Adelphic Society, and he does so, and he parrots his father's positions. Now we're talking 1816, 1817. The canal is coming, but not yet there. Seward writes papers and gives orations denouncing the Erie Canal as a path to financial ruin. He says Governor Clinton is placing a stain on the office. Governor Clinton was a large figure in New York Federalist politics. He'd been the Federalist candidate for president in 1816. He was the mayor of New York City and knew what an engine the Erie Canal could be to really establish that city as a mercantile metropolis, and was a big advocate for growing it. By the time he's elected governor, he's in a position to actually act and push these dreams into reality. And this is the world that Seward is in college and he's arguing about, and he's arguing against it. And how does he do that? If I can read you the exact quote. What Clinton presents to us all is an alarming picture of debt, taxation, and bankruptcy for the state. In later years, Seward would rue having ever put his name behind these words. Papers, you can still read some of these in the Union College archives, including a commencement address he gives when he graduates in 1820, arguing against consolidated power in Washington, D.C. In later years, he said he didn't know it yet, but what he was setting himself out to do was to disenthrall himself from the influence of tradition and personal association. Ordinarily, that's what we do in college. We're free from the household, from the influence of our parents. We're free to think new thoughts, figure out who we are. That's not what Seward does. He stays through Union College, a Jeffersonian Democrat. He's his father's son, and he complains. I went the wrong way again. I'll get the hang of this. His senior year at Union, that the big ditch, as they called it, has made so many proselytes here to the Clintonian creed, it is almost heresy to declare oneself a Madisonian. And in fact, there were times when he thought about aligning himself with his pro-slavery Southern classmates, because at least they agreed with him on how erroneous and foolish the Erie Canal was going to be as a venture. So he does not use college to figure out who he is. He's convinced he's his father's son and will carry on the Seward mantle. He graduates from Union College, and he has never yet set foot on this canal. So work begins in 1817. By 1820, the year that Seward graduates from Union, there is service from New York to about Utica, Little Falls. The first tolls are starting to come in, and the tolls very quickly are telling a success story. The Erie Canal will pay for itself within a few years. It will cut travel time. New York to Buffalo, no more overland route past Albany and the Hudson, from 32 days to 5. It will reduce the cost of shipping and transportation and travel by 90%. Pardon me. But Seward himself has avoided the Erie Canal. When he went to Union College, he took stagecoach and steamship on the Hudson. When he went to New York City, same thing. He made a point. He had denounced this. He couldn't, in any good conscience, set foot on a packet boat and prove Clinton was right. He goes to New York City. He starts work in a law firm. He's apprenticing himself out, preparing to sit the bar exam. And he joins what were called the Bucktails. This is a New York chapter of the Democratic Party. It's a faction particularly aligned with the Red Fox of Kinderhook, Martin Van Buren, who will control the Regency, the New York political machine that held sway throughout much of the early and mid-19th century. One newspaper reported, let's see if I can find the exact quote, just how much Seward was a believer in this. He was so thoroughgoing a bucktail, it was reported, that he himself dealt out unmeasured censure to those who deviated from that faith. And he joins debate clubs in New York City as a young lawyer. He aligns himself with the Young Democrats. He's part of the Tammany Hall up-and-coming machine. Okay. While he loved New York, an exciting life of literary societies, balls, young lawyers, young ladies he was trying to pitch woo to, there was a lot of competition, a glut of hungry young lawyers, all aspiring for the same opportunities, economic growth that Seward wanted for himself. And so his father makes a rather curious choice, one he surely had cause to regret many, many times thereafter. He tells his son, why don't we send you west on a little bit of an exploratory mission? We'll send you to Utica. It's the furthest western court in New York you can take the bar exam. You'll sit the bar there, you'll explore opportunities, maybe you'll make a couple of quick bucks, and the plan is we will bring you home afterwards, and you can skip a couple of steps in whatever law firm is worthy of you. Or heck, his father actually says, I will pay to open up a law practice for you, and you will become the top lawyer in Orange County. He gives his son about $50, sends him west. Seward passes the bar in Utica, and while he's there, he explores as far west as he can what opportunities might be available. And he hears about a little place, Auburn, where there's a law firm owned by a man, Elijah Miller, where there might just be an opening. Puts that in mind. But it's about ends as much as means. For the first time, William Seward sets foot on the packet boat that will bear him west, and he experiences the Erie Canal for himself. And this is his revelation moment. This is his conversion moment. This is transformative for him. He literally feels the world shift under his feet, or as he writes, certain heavy scales fell from my eyes. Everything I believed was wrong. Everything my father told me was true was false. And it was, again, like a religious conversion, as if he was being baptized and being born again as a new man who suddenly believed the opposite of what heretofore he always subscribed to and held dear and held true. As I descended from the wharf and entered the packet boat that was to convey me on the Erie Canal, which just 2 years before he had pronounced impracticable, and 80 miles to Auburn. And he's not done. Elijah Miller does hire him. Seward is so enthralled, he gets to Auburn, he takes the job. We'll get back into that. But he decides he's got to follow this thing down to the end. And what we're seeing here is an image from the Seward House collections, Seward's own painting of the Erie Canal by the artist Frederick Bruce. Seward decides, I'm going to ride this thing to its western terminal point, all the way to Buffalo. And he writes about what it was like to get to the end of the canal, the end of the line, east to west. My mind, he wrote, for the first time, swelled with a large, though by no means complete conception of the grandeur and beneficence of the system of internal improvements in which my native state was so deeply engaged. Whatever doubts I had before entertained in regard to the direction of my political course, I now determined to give my best effort to the achievement of the enterprise, which, while it would greatly exalt the state of New York, would tend to increase immeasurably the wealth, prosperity, greatness of the whole republic. So a couple interesting things there. We can see the wheels turning. We can see the conversion. He also admits, as yet, it's an incomplete concept. I know no longer what I stand against, but what am I really going to stand for? I'm turning around in the Erie Canal, but beyond believing in this one thing, this old Federalist notion of internal improvements, what else do I stand for? What comes next after the Erie Canal? Not that the Erie Canal is nothing, because he's going to devote a lot of political capital into it. Seward comes to work for Elijah Miller in the spring of 1823. He arrives here Christmas Eve 1822, is an up-and-comer and gets exactly what his father envisioned. Quick path to success. Go west, young man, was said for a reason. He did. Vast opportunity for social mobility. By 1824, a year and a half into the arrangement, he's been made a full partner in the law firm. Imagine how long that would have taken him if he'd stayed in Manhattan. He's making good money. He's got a sky's the limit potential for growth, and he marries the boss's daughter, Elijah Miller's younger daughter, Frances, will move into that yellow house on 33 South Street. It's a propitious marriage in a number of ways. We often talk about why Frances was a strong political spouse for him. But in this case, becoming the son-in-law of Elijah Miller was also going to be very useful. As he wrote to his father after his wedding, good news, Judge Miller has adopted me as his son. That was not what Samuel wanted to hear. He wanted his boy to come home. And Judge Miller made Seward promise when they got married they would never do that. They would stay in that house and raise their family there, which they do. And Elijah Miller is a very different political animal and a man than Seward's father. Quaker, progressive lawyer. he and Seward have a lot more in common than Seward and his father by this point, by the conversion point. And he abets that conversion. Miller also is and has been a believer in canals. He was pro-Clinton, pro-canal all the time. And he's an investor in what will be a startup company here in Auburn, a lot of capital, because while the state builds the Erie Canal, it's going to be a fight to build any extensions to it for something called the Auburn and Owasco Canal Company, which has visions. Auburn, of course, is bypassed by the canal. We'll get into that, of righting that wrong. So very amenable. William and Frances marry October 2018-24, and a little over a year later, the wedding of the Waters is complete. Many of you probably were a part of the Seneca Chiefs' trip from Buffalo to New York and the bringing of waters from Lake Erie into New York Harbor, as Clinton did, ousted from power, now in the Canal Commission, marking the end of that original Erie Canal project after 7 years of construction and almost a quarter century of fighting and debating. It was real and it was here to stay. So Seward's in a very good spot. He attends the original Seneca Chiefs journey. Of course, the canal ran through Weedsport. So he and Frances and Elijah Miller go north, and they wave. There's a firework display. There's great speech making, much like the 250th commemoration. They see the boat go by. This is courtesy of the Erie Canal Museum. They didn't have a Weedsport ticket, so pretend it says Weedsport. And Seward is brought deeply into the fold. Now, as I was saying, Auburn was bypassed by the Erie Canal. Seward writes to his father, while the work on the canal was in progress, the good people here made unavailing efforts to have that great channel of commerce pass through, to no avail. Too much marshland, too much elevation, too big of a challenge. It's not to be. But Seward is rising quickly through society. He's a colonel in the local militia, a vestryman in the Episcopal Church by age 26, and his father-in-law, who's also the senior partner at the law firm, the big man at home, hires Seward another line of salary to be the secretary for the Auburn and Owasco Canal Company. And this becomes his job on the side. He says, the job now, link Auburn to the Erie Canal via the Owasco outlet and the digging of the lateral canal. The investors, Seward writes, propose to dig another canal from the Owasco Lake to the moraine debris through Moravia to the watershed of the Susquehanna, linking Auburn directly with the Chesapeake Bay, Baltimore, or even Pittsburgh. So, Auburnians, though they are left out of the Auburn Canal's pathway, dream of themselves a smaller version of New York, and there are some in Auburn who think, we might yet become the state capital. We've already got this investment in the prison. We could become a canal hub 9 miles south of the main line, through the outlet, into the lake, and then connections through other feeder canals all the way to Susquehanna, Pennsylvania, Baltimore. That was a real dream that mimickers of DeWitt Clinton thought was possible for Auburn, and it was Seward's job to go to Albany to try to get the funding. But there was a problem in Albany. The Democrats, the Regency, the party that Seward had belonged to, was firmly entrenched. They held all levers of power. They had ousted Clinton. They had majorities in the House and the state Senate. They were not going to be spending more money. Yes, they all agreed the Erie Canal was paying for itself. The investment had paid off. But now, to double down and build a host of extensions, that was a folly, and they had turned off the spigot. The canal is the canal, but doubling the canal, now that's a bridge too far. So Seward finds himself sort of shut out and turned away. These feeder canals are not going to get the same funding the Erie Canal got, and it's going to be private capital. It's going to have to do the work. Seward finds the hard way. In 1828, the canal is so popular, New Yorkers love it. Even the Democrats don't criticize it anymore. They just don't want to reinvest. DeWitt Clinton is reelected governor, back to the governor's mansion, and Seward calls upon him in 1828, that winter. He wants to lobby his case. He also is going to be offered patronage, political position in DeWitt Clinton's administration. What he's asked to do, quid pro quo, to be given a position and to help advance the Auburn and Owasco Canal's interests, is 1828 is a national election year. Andrew Jackson is going to try again. This time he will defeat John Quincy Adams. Clinton knows that is the most likely outcome. He does not want to make an enemy of Jackson or Van Buren. So he says, we cannot come out for Adams. We have to be sidelined or pro-Jacksonian. And the Jacksonian Democrats, the inheritors, though much more populist, of the Jeffersonian Democratic Party of his father, Seward can't do that. He's already made this conversion. He is going to be part of a new opposition party. He doesn't know what it's going to look like yet, doesn't have a name yet. But he can't do it. He can't take the job. He leaves Albany empty-handed. And then he says, ignominy on top of ignominy. It is not long later, in fact, it is mere weeks after his visit, that DeWitt Clinton dies in office. And Seward says, well, at least he escaped the trial of the consequences of his own political associations, dead of apoplexy in his residence. For myself, I persevere, and I will follow his policies. I will inherit what Clinton started now that he is gone. Who will take up the reins? We need these lateral canals. That's what we're trying to do, to build canals that link north to south along the east-west corridor of the Erie Canal. Seward runs for office for the first time in the next cycle, 1830. 29 years old, elected to a state Senate seat. He is one of 7 non-Democrats. There are 32 Democrats as part of the Regency. So about 75% of that body is in the pocket of Martin Van Buren, thus anti-canal. So Seward does not actually get very much accomplished. He represents the West, a part of the state that wants new canal investment, that wants to link all communities, especially down south of the canal and north of the canal, into Clinton's project. Seward himself makes a name during these years advocating. As a state senator, knowing he doesn't have the vote, but knowing he can still command some attention, begins to sketch out a vision for canals, and eventually himself. I make the case here to you now for the construction, branches and tributaries to all distant portions of the state, he argues in 1834. He attaches his name, and we could justify a claim by right, the construction of all of these branches: Chenango Canal, Black River Canal, Oswego Canal, Seneca and Cayuga Canal, Chemung Canal, Genesee Valley Canal, and of course, good old Auburn and Owasco Canal. A little bit of a conflict of interest there. He says we should not only do that, we should reinvest in the main line. It's 40 feet wide. The traffic is so dense that there are jams. We should double it. It should be at least 70 feet wide. It's only 4 feet deep. Larger and larger barges are getting stuck. We need to make it at least 7 feet deep. We need double locks, bigger tow paths. In 1833, while he's a state senator, he goes on a trip to Europe. He makes a study of Holland's canal system and says we should adopt what they have. We don't need a tow path. They've got beautiful roads. And he wanted to adopt all these improvements, all this growth, and he becomes a stalwart champion for canals. So much so that in 1834, he does 2 things. He joins the brand new opposition Whig Party, which is really born out of protesting against Andrew Jackson. They don't know what they really stand for yet. They know they stand against Jacksonian democratic politics. And he runs for governor at age just 33. Now, he'll be trounced pretty badly by the Jacksonian Democrat, William Marcy. If you, perhaps like my father-in-law here, know your 46 Peaks, you might know that Mount Marcy and Mount Seward are side by side, just as they are in our history of New York governors. But these men were bitter rivals. Marcy denounced Seward as a scamp and a youth without the experience. Seward says, you're a pet of Andrew Jackson, and you have bankrupted New York. You've taken all of the revenue from our canal system, which produces 4 and 5 times the profit to the cost every year, and you've spoiled it. You've invested all in Jacksonian banks and projects and corrupt jobs for your fellow office seekers. You represent corruption. I'm a new day. He loses, but he campaigns on a platform of canals. Let me think if I can find what he actually says here. Aha. Here's his go-to line. I am, and I have ever been, not really ever, the advocate of the system of internal improvements by means of railroads and canals. I regard it as one of the most important duties of the government, as fast as its rapidly developing resources will allow, to prosecute a full system of improvements. Again, he loses, but he makes a big name for himself. Long before people thought about the name Seward and anti-slavery or anything else, Seward and pro-canals, pro-internal improvements But as he himself admits, he's incomplete. He's still trying to figure out what else. How do we build a complete vision of politics? He does not hold his state Senate seat when he runs for governor. He gives it up. He loses. He comes back to Auburn, and he gets back in with the moneyed people of the Auburn and Owasco Canal Consortium and resumes his advocacy work and is delighted his first year back. Now, this is from our friends at the Cayuga Museum. Karen found this image for me of the big dam, which had to be done because the Owasco outlet was about 40 feet higher in elevation than the canal was going to be. So it was going to be a not quite as big a work of public engineering and hydraulics as the canal itself, but not insignificant and not inexpensive. And that work began in earnest with capital gathered in the fall of 1835 with the laying of a cornerstone and the beginning of work on what would be called the Big Dam. And all of Auburn turned out for this, almost like it's 1825 again. They're coming to see the Seneca chief. A parade of people marched to the laying of the ceremony. There's bands. Everybody is marching with their guilds or their professions. And all of Auburn turns out. There's great coverage of this in Elliot Stork's History of Cayuga County, Hall's History of Auburn. I'd encourage you to read it. It's really like a party atmosphere, almost like Lafayette's coming back. And Seward is going to give the keynote address, the man who didn't just miss out, but was a competitive candidate for governor, putting Auburn on the map. And he gives a speech. Now, in the paper I wrote for the Canal Museum, I dive into this speech quite a bit. It's got three main parts to it. He attacks the Democrats. He says they have personally benefited. Their eastern property has exploded in value thanks to the canal. They would deny that same benefit to us here in the West. They're holding us back. He then makes the case for why the canal is profitable and desirable. But for, I think, the first time, he begins to layer on new aspects of his vision that's positive and not just negative. What else does it mean to be a Whig, to believe in these things? You can read for yourself. Neither the happiness of our people or the stability of our government depends on the length or number of canals or railroads. That's good, but that is just a starting point. That is just a foundational block. We have to do more. We shall not be judged by these improvements, but we shall be judged by the incredible impression we shall have left upon the moral condition of our country. And in this speech, he goes on to lay out a platform for state commensurate investments in education reform, in prison reform, in immigration reform, in contesting slavery where it still surfaced in New York. And these tenets, plus canals, which always play really well, are what he will bring when he makes his political bid for comeback 4 years later against William Marcy. Quick slide, he also sows up support in the West during these years away. He goes out to Westfield. He really rallies the South, what we call the Southern Tier, places that are so far away from the canal they haven't been touched by it. He needs these voters. He needs to run up the score in the West to compete with the Regency's stronghold in New York City and downstate. So he needs all of Western New York at his back if he's going to topple Martin Van Buren's party and Marcy in a rematch. And that's exactly what happens. He goes again on the stump, and now he's not just arguing against Jackson. Fortunately for Seward, Jackson's out of power, and he's left economic recession in his wake. All that Jacksonian deregulation and hands-off government have caused banks to fail. Hamilton's system has been destroyed. There's no national bank to prop it back up, and the economy is in free fall. So it's a good time. The headwinds are at Seward's back to be saying we need a stronger, more powerful government to fix our economy, yes, but also to build canals and take on some of these other vast projects. The next thing that we can do as a society is we can build up a library system as good as, to rival what the canal did, its transformational effect. Use this canal revenue to build up the best public education system in New York. So he paints this progressive and broad vision for how a strong government could be a force for good in the lives of the people of New York. And of course, the Erie Canal is going to get that money. And those lateral canals are going to get built. And this time, Seward sweeps to power. Gubernatorial portrait of Seward there. He declares himself upon his victory to be the true heir and inheritor of DeWitt Clinton's legacy and agenda. He cements that fact in the minds of New Yorkers by taking as his governor's mansion the one where DeWitt Clinton lived. When you come to the Seward House next, come to our dining room and see that house on display, a painting of it. He hired back Clinton's old servants. He invited the comparisons. He wanted his name to be linked next to Clinton's in New York State. He also prepared what he considered to be the best New York inaugural address ever concocted. He said, in the past, incoming administrations have produced dry as dust text just full of facts and figures. He says, I am going to write a Homeric epic. It will be lyrical, and it will extol the virtues of my vision, from canals down to anti-slavery and pro-public education. So he works very hard on it, and he delivers what he considers at that point in his career to be the finest piece of work he's ever done. And he grounds his inaugural address, the first subject, after thanking everybody for putting aside partisan acrimony, at least for a little while, to the subject that's occupied his mind most over the last, let's say, 15 years, the Erie Canal. And here's what he has to say. Let me find my... before I get to that. Seward is in a familiar position as governor. Yes, he's the chief executive of the state, but the Democrats still control pretty much everything else in Albany. He is not going to be able to have the votes to just, by sheer force of will and determination, expand the canal, build lateral canals. He's still going to need to use a case of moral suasion and convincing to tell the voters of New York why they need to join with him, put pressure on their elected representatives, and support his visions. All he can do as governor of New York is what he sets out to do without having the legislature, which is to clean up corruption in patronage. So the Erie Canal Commission, he says, is full of Democrats who hate the canal but don't mind getting rich, having offices as toll collectors and canal commissioners. They're filling their pockets up while warning New Yorkers, we can't spend any more money on canals because we'll go bankrupt. We're going to clean house. We're going to have transparency. We're going to have openness. We're going to know what these guys are making. We're going to have term limits, and we are going to audit the Canal Commission every year. Now, that is not Homeric. That is just housekeeping. Then he gets into his sweeping oratory. What do canals mean? Why do we care about them? Through canals and everything else he'll propose later in this address, he says, together, the people of New York can achieve a higher standard of social perfection than has ever yet been attained, creating a spirit which shall renovate the world. Out of the same impetus that produced the Erie Canal, New Yorkers should come together and build an extraordinary society. It would be grounded in universal education for men and women, people of all races and backgrounds, no checks, investment in libraries, overhauling our prison system, state resources to support immigration, new legal rights for women, and other bold reforms of all stripes. So from the Erie Canal, this is the wellspring from which everything else can emerge. Not just because the Erie Canal is profitable, because it shows what concentrated power can do as a force for positive good. These are the next natural iterations, in addition to, of course, those lateral canals. But none of that happens. He fails to achieve any of the things he wants in every one of his inaugural addresses, and he'll be reelected in 1840. Gubernatorial terms were 2 years back then. That was a concession that DeWitt Clinton made as governor to get canal votes. He committed political suicide. He said, you can vote me out of power in 2 years if I get the votes for this canal. He got the votes. He got voted out. So terms were shortened. And the Democrats, in majorities, refused time and time again to build lateral canals, to to deepen, to widen, to build double lockages. Seward calls an emergency session in 1842. The canal is still making all this money, but it's falling apart because not a cent that he can't control is being reinvested back in it. And he says, trying to shame the legislature, for the first time in the quarter of a century, which has elapsed since the ground was broken, a governor of the state of New York, in meeting the legislature, finds himself unable to announce continued progress of improvement. To handcuff Seward in 1842, the legislature passes something called the Stop and Tax Law, which said the Erie Canal is not going to be enlarged. And any money that's going to be spent in the canal is not going to come from the tolls and revenue, but from direct property taxes, which means if you want a canal in your backyard, you're paying for it, even though the canal very easily could. This is all petty and personal. When Seward leaves the governor's mansion, the Democrats, who truly do like the canal, and their voters do too, relent. They revive construction, and major work continues. By the middle and later 1840s, the canal is pronounced finished in 1861. So Seward asked for it, and he got it. He wanted to be in the position of DeWitt Clinton, which means some of the glory, but a lot of the headache and a lot of the acrimony. He becomes the target in the face of who the Regency Democrats hate most, and will, as much to spite him as do good, fight against canals and other signs of progress. Seward can't even, as governor, get the legislature to follow him every year he asks. DeWitt Clinton died in near poverty. He was not good with his money. His family was destitute. His remains were simply interred in the vault of a family friend. There was no public memorial or monument to Clinton, and Seward thought that was a shame. Every year he asked Albany to afford the money. He wanted it to be on the Capitol grounds. DeWitt Clinton should be buried there, and we'll build a public monument. And his idea was it's a place where New Yorkers from all future generations can come and dream big dreams just like he did, a place of remembrance and hope. The Democrats say, no, you're not getting that. And he didn't. By the 1850s, friends gathered and they reinterred him in Greenwood Cemetery in Brooklyn, and that's where his grave is today. 2 terms as governor, a frustrated Seward leaves Albany, and while he has largely failed to achieve all he wants on canals, he has succeeded in building a strong and convincing case, building a positive vision for what the Whigs, if granted power, could do, and has at least put himself up there in the filigree with DeWitt Clinton as a big progressive crusader in New York State. He's figured out who he is, what he stands for, and maybe he didn't win many of the fights he fought in New York, but he was happy to have fought them, and they're won once he's gone anyway. What comes next? He leaves Albany. The railroads are coming next. They will compete with canals. And even in Auburn here, Owasco and Auburn is sort of sunk into the recession of 1837. And the investors say, you know what, we're better off. We'll invest instead in the Auburn and Syracuse rail line. It'll be more convenient. He comes back home, revives the law practice, but plans a relaunch. He will go on to the U.S. Senate and Secretary of State. These are chapters of his career that we know very well. But he'll bring a lot with him. And just because he leaves Albany, and just because the last fights over funding or expanding the Erie Canal are over as far as Seward is concerned, he is not done having them. He does not drop the canal in his thinking, in his writing, in his oratory, and it remains what it was for him as a young man, a building block for him to project a larger, progressive Whig Republican vision. He actually finds the Erie Canal is a wonderful rhetorical device. One of the things that surprised me most when looking into whether to write this essay or give a talk for the Erie Canal Museum was how obsessed Seward himself became over the Erie Canal. Now, political oratory, I'll go faster. We're getting to phase 2. Political oratory in the 19th century was spectacle and theater. Speeches might last hours. People would bring their own alcohol, and they would sit and listen and hoot and holler. Debates were blood sport. So this was not for the faint of heart. And Seward, in particular, liked grounding his speeches in history. And he found the success story of the Erie Canal was a very powerful way to ramp up to the success story he was trying to tell about what he proposed to do next. Because this, therefore we can do that. And from the early 1840s, really into the end of his life, he is forever coming back to that moment when the certain heavy scales fell off his eyes. He was no longer blind, for he could see, whether it was on canals or his higher political vision in general. Could he recreate that sensation? He couldn't obviously take everybody by the scruff of the neck, put them in a canal boat and say, you're converted just like me. I can't make you do that. But perhaps I can conjure the power of that experience and convince you, I was once like you, I doubted. I can convince you of the righteousness of not only the canal, but the natural successors to the canal's legacy, these vast projects of state development. Even in his own household, this is his younger son, William Jr., his daughter, Fanny, he kind of fed them prescriptive literature. One of my favorite finds was this book, Marco Polo, Erie Canal from 1852, which he gives to his son, Will. And on its face, it's an adventure novel, but really it's an educational text about the history of the Erie Canal. And it's sort of fun to imagine them reading this together. There's the whole series of Marco Polo's voyages. They were novels for boys, and really they taught American history as well as morality. In this book, the character Marco encounters swindlers and gamblers and drunkards on the canal boats and has to make good choices while also learning about the history and having a lot of fun. What he could do for his children, he thought he could do for the nation. So in the latter half of my essay, I get into quite a few of the political speeches and tracts that Seward authors in the 1840s, 50s, and 60s. And this essay is available on the Seward House website. I won't force you to listen to 20 minutes of me going line by line. But in short, let me give you my walk-away conclusions of what Seward was attempting to do with the Erie Canal and public memory. I'm going to read to you just for a moment. Seward, as a senator and Secretary of State, did not forget where he came from, nor the revelatory experience with which the canal that rebirthed his political self. Just as the Erie Canal was essential in determining Seward's conversion to a certain brand of progressivism, it remained central to his public identity and a fixture in his oratory and writings. While Seward became famous for anti-slavery diatribes about higher laws and irrepressible conflicts, his affinities for canals never strayed far from the words he carefully crafted. And if you read these speeches, the lines aren't remembered anymore, but often he includes a history of canals as a useful device in these speeches. What he described as his Homeric styling was no mere affectation, a well-honed intentionality. And for Seward, the origin story of the Erie Canal that he worked hard to tell and make the official version worked on several levels. Grounded in the human dramas of the people who had built it, the saga of the canal also contained ready-made heroes and villains, those who advocated it selflessly, like Clinton, and then their analogs, Seward in later years. Seward's heroes aligned with his half of the political spectrum, where Whigs carried on in Clinton's image. In his telling, therefore, the Erie Canal story became one of overcoming insurmountable obstacles, a pan for human improvement through determination and collective effort. It augured the potential for the next great enterprise, or social engineering, or all future spiritual successors to the canal. And in speech after speech, Seward does this. He repeats himself. He wants to have the last word. He wants to be the one for his time and for all time to tell the story the way Clinton would have liked, in a very flattering and favorable light. In my essay, I begin by talking about Seward as governor. Actually writes a very interesting piece. There's 170 words on the history of the Erie Canal from his point of view. Prosperity, natural harmony. This is a love letter to the Erie Canal and DeWitt Clinton. And then the winking implication is the next things are the things that I am doing. He uses canals in his 1840s and 1850s pro-immigration speech against nativists. And I have a number of these in my essay. But he says, in my day, DeWitt Clinton's Erie Canal was stigmatized as the Irish ditch, as well as his folly. And he begins by telling the incredible story about how the Erie Canal was actually indeed the product of an incredible body of immigrant laborers. Without immigrants, there would have been no Erie Canal. Then, as now being Seward's 1850s, there were those opponents, nativists, those who decried the rights of any immigrants to come onto these shores, who lumped in their anti-immigration to anti-canal fervor. Seward wants to go the opposite. We need the infusions of new people who seek out democracy to join our ranks. It is through all of us, including and especially immigrants who are paying their dues in these early years, to take on these vast projects. He uses the Erie Canal again and again and again. He compares the North and the Midwest, areas that have canals, disfavorably again and again and again against what he would call backwater and provincial southern states. And so he tells the story of American history as a tale of haves and have-nots. Progressive, industrial, free labor, canal places thank goodness we had that origin story, the places where no canals were ever built. I will read to you just one little taste and then encourage you. Again, go to the Seward House website and you can read page after page after page of Jeff on William Seward. But I will just give you the shortened version of this. Okay, if I can. Aha. Wait, I think I was on the wrong page. Yes, here we are. In 1855, he stares down his Southern colleagues in the Senate, and he says, I have seen slavery in the slave states and freedom in the free states. I have even seen both slavery and freedom in this state, in New York. I know all too well the evils of being willing to spare any effort to prevent its return. He recalls the New York of his childhood, where slavery had endured. Suppose 50 years ago, New York, like Maryland and Virginia today, had clung to slavery. If my father's vision, this is him calling out his dad 50 years later, if my father's vision of New York had been allowed to endure, New York in 1855 would look like Virginia in 1805, which is to say it would look like what New York looked like 50 years ago. No progress. Where then would we have been the Erie Canal, the Genesee Valley, the Oswego, the Seneca, the Crooked Lake Canal, the Chemung Canal? And he goes on like this. Where would have been the colleges, the academies, the schools, yielding information and instruction to children in all languages? Go ask Virginia. Go ask noble Maryland, expending as she is a giant's strength in the serpent's coils of slavery. Go ask them to show you her people. What shape are they in? Ask them to show you their canals. Their silence is their answer. And this is just one example. When he campaigns for Lincoln, canals, canals, canals. Take my word for it or read the essay. As Secretary of State, he has a little less speech-making to be doing, and especially during the Civil War, he's glad to have the canal, but he turns his attention elsewhere. After the Civil War and his service under Lincoln, serving under Andrew Johnson, Seward is not done with canals. Well after the Alaska Treaty is done and settled, he has treaty in hand to build what would have been the Panama Canal, 30 years before it was built. He had a treaty with the government of Colombia to build what they would have called the Darien Gap Canal, not that far from where the modern-day Erie Canal is. Then, as in Seward's youth, his political opponents held sway in the halls of Congress. They hated his president, Andrew Johnson. They just barely let him get Alaska. They weren't going to give Seward a win like this. And so often, whether it's the Erie Canal and its extensions, an early version of the Panama Canal, Seward is a champion, and perhaps his ardency is what ultimately cost some of the victories he might have won. Had he been somebody else as governor or secretary of state or senator, canals might have had a better day. They might have gotten votes, because Seward was there and he was well hated by his opposition. But they wouldn't have had as good a champion. In his retirement, Seward says rest is rust. He is going to travel the world. And just like as a young man studying Dutch canals, he's got to study the canals of the world. Look what they're doing in Egypt, the Suez Canal. Seward's among the first Americans to sail along it. The imperial canals of China still have something to teach us, though hundreds of years old they were. And he writes lengthy pieces making their study. This is a line from his 170 pages Notes on the State of New York, which I will leave here for you to read, about what he thought the canal would mean, a testament that would endure long after all the men who, and he would have said men, who built it were dead, a testament to the age of which it came. I want to close by reading my own conclusion, and then happy to take any questions. Thank you for hanging with me as I customarily go a little bit long. But we'll be done by 1 o'clock. Sometimes follies are a matter of perspective. And I conclude by talking about Clinton's folly and Seward's folly and their place side by side in Seward's mind anyway. Follies are a matter of perspective. In the end, the canal has always been a contested space. It is an idea as much as it is a construct. A place where generations of New Yorkers have reflected on the past and projected their hopes and fears onto the future. Certainly that was Seward's experience. Seward was among the very first to recognize and grapple with this complicated inheritance. Whenever he looked at the Erie Canal, as a young man in midlife, as an older man, It must have brought him back to the clarity of that life-altering, original, paradigm-shifting voyage. Surely, he believed, if he fought hard enough, spoke eloquently enough, there had to be a way to awaken and rekindle that old spirit. Perhaps even to remove the certain heavy scales from the eyes of a nation too often blind to the lights of new possibilities for better and brighter tomorrows. And that's my essay. And my talk. Thank you.